True Tales of the Rails, Actual Happenings as Told by Eyewitnesses. Railroad Magazine, November 1947. Nostalgia by Harry McClintock. Nostalgia hit me when I pursued Maxwell Swan's Wanderlust in July, August, and September 1945 issues of Railroad, and I still carry the bruises, so to speak. Swan and I had some correspondence about Betteravia. The fact that each of us had ornamented a footboard at that obscure point intrigued us both. It was no port of call for boomers' rails. I'll gamble a few pesos that no more than a handful of the itchy-footed fraternity have ever heard of it. It was, and is, located at the end of a 3-mile branch on the Southern Pacific, the main line end of said branch being a whistle stop named Guadalupe. There was also a 9-mile branch of the narrow-gauge Pacific Coast Railroad, which supplied the only passenger transportation between Santa Maria and the mainline connection with SP trains for the big towns of Los Angeles and San Francisco. I was picking up a scoop or two of beer in the H&H bar in San Luis Obispo when the music came of Betterava's first saluted my enraptured ears. H. Hunsaker, ex-SP conductor and proprietor of the H&H, informed me that there was an office for a switchman at Betteravia, and that a turnaround freight crew would leave for there at 7 the next morning. It did, and I was on it. One of the shacks on that turnaround was Charlie Logwood, Stinger Griever of San Luis. He introduced me to Dick Hines, engine foreman for the sugar factory, and I was working immediately. No application, no reference, no examination, and no watch, all of which was right down my alley. A room prowler had made for me a fairly good suit, my watch, service levers, and BRT receipts in a cheap hotel in San Jose about a week before. The so-and-so also carried off what loose change I had. Damn him. And he even traded shoes. He left me with a pair that I would scarcely squeeze my feet into. We'll pass over the argument I had with the hotel man. Somebody called the cops and we both had a ride in the black wagon. They had to wrap me in a blanket. All I had was my underwear, and there wasn't much of that left. The jailer had to fit me out with underwear, overalls, shirt, and shoes before I could face the judge next morning. His Honor, after a lot of questioning, came up with a Solomon-like decision that the landlord should pay me $15 for my lost property, and that I should pocket said dinero and get the hell out of San Jose and stay out. Lacking Stinger credentials that would have opened some caboose doors, I rode boxcars to San Luis Obispo, and no observer could have picked me out from the rest of the bums. Luckily, I knew a couple of rails in San Luis. I also had most of that $15 left, and I could front up with new khaki pants, a couple of decent-looking shirts, a necktie, and a pair of cheap elk shoes. The whole outfit set me back less than $7, and good old Hunsaker stacked me to a nearly new fawn-colored Stetson that some absent-minded customer had forgotten when he left the H&H bar. I was again clean and presentable. In the West at the time, if you wore a $10 hat, the rest of your clothes didn't really matter. So within 20 minutes of my arrival at Betteravia, I was on the footboard of a switch engine, and my heart was that old comfortable feeling of being once more listed on a payroll, to say nothing of knowing where the evening biscuits and the comfortable flop were waiting. The factory was owned by the Union Sugar Company, and the yield of more than 15,000 acres of sugar beets was processed in a 5-month campaign, the term by which the manufacturing season was known. Union Sugar regularly leased an engine from the SP and hired a crew consisting of engineer, fireman, engine foreman, and one switchman to operate same. Morning and evening we pulled the sugar house, dragging out 4 or 5 loads and spotting many empties. One string of standard gauge beet racks arrived every morning with the SP turning round, and the Pacific Coast delivering an average of 3 trains of 10 or 12 slim gauge Lincoln Pen racks each day. Neither road delivered on Sunday. Sugar cars were weighed before and after each loading, but beet racks were weighted only when loaded. Between short spans of labor, we had plenty of time to loaf around the stranded boxcar that served as an office for the SB front agent, and to keep one another up to date on the standing of Major League ball clubs, the apparent trends in national politics, and similar switch shanty topics. I had never dropped into a softer spot. For 5 months I never wore a coat. In fact, I didn't own one. For 5 months I never filled a lamp nor polished a globe. I don't believe that there were any lanterns, or that any of the crew could have given valid testimony as to whether the acetylene headlights on the old 1040 would or would not operate, and not a single drop of rain fell. The company-owned hotel served man-sized meals that were always well-cooked and appetizing. My room was as severe and simple as a monastic cell, but it was clean as a pin, with a single bed as comfortable as any I'd ever slept in. Betterava, with its 5-month tenure of office, was strictly a boomer job, but the opening of each campaign saw at least one repeater on the crew of the switch engine. And now let us take up the matter of the weak drawbars and the slim gauge cars that seemed to pull out so easily and cause Maxwell Swan so much grief. I worked on the same job with the same hogger, spotting the same cars on the same scales, and we didn't have 5 minutes trouble in 5 months of weighing. But that was 1 year later. The evidence would seem to indicate that Dick Hines and I were better men than Dandy Jack Carroll and Maxwell Swan. We were like hell. The answer to the 64 question was sitting right up in the engine cab, and his name was Lyle R. Gardner. Gardner was young, and he was ambitious, and above all he was highly intelligent. He had fired for a couple of months on the slim gauge, which enabled him to hire out as an experienced tallow pot into the SB. He stayed with that for almost 2 years, while he devoted some of his spare time to memorizing damn near every word of the locomotive catechism and to mastering an ICS course on air brakes. He wanted to sit on the right-hand side of the cab and yank a throttle, to feel the surge of power as a big freight hog started a full-tonnage drag. He must have pictured himself on the sharp end of a gleaming streak of varnish and rocketing down through the night-darkened Salinas Valley with a clean white beam of the electric headlights like a shining sword ahead, and the echoes of a mellow chime whistle bouncing back from the lonely hills. Well, if he stayed where he was, it was going to be a long time before that happened. The Southern Pacific engines were all oil burners, and twiddling the grease valves of one of those babies was lots softer than the padding of one fanny on the scoop shovel. As Swan pointed out, there were no boomer tallow pops in California. Sizing up possibilities, it looked to Gardner as though it would be something like 12 or 14 years before accumulated whiskers would move him across the cab. To a guy in the restless early 20s, that sounded like a century or at least a lifetime. He was young and blond and good-looking. He dressed well, danced well, plunked a mean mandolin, sang a pleasing tenor, and he was not one to be avoided by the ladies. He wanted to be a hogger while he still possessed all those desirable qualifications. There must be some way to beat the game, Gardner resolved before his joints began to creak and the capillary substance ceased to vegetate in his cranium. Then, in the early spring of the year 1910, our hero scum a scheme, formulated a plan, or figured an angle. It might not work, but there is an even chance it would. At least he could give it the earnest old college try. One fine day in April, Mr. Lyle R. Gardner presented himself to the office in Mr. F. J. McCoy at Betterava. McCoy was also young. He was tall and lean and good-looking, and he was the big boss superintendent. Gardner applied for the job as hogger during the next campaign, which would start about June 1st. I am in engine service on the Southern Pacific, running out of San Luis Obispo, he stated. I'd like a vacation from mainline work for a few months, but can't afford to be idle for that length of time. 5 months of straight daylight worked on your switch engine would seem like a paid vacation to a lot of mainline men. McCoy was a darn good guy. Besides, he was looking at an applicant with a pleasing personality who was dressed in well-tailored clothes and whose language was as good as that of any college graduate. Gardner had made a sale. I'd like 3 or 4 weeks' notice when you need me, Gardner said. I'll have to make my arrangements with the Southern Pacific. The super agreed, and Gardner rose, ready to bow out. Just one more favor, he smiled. You'll want to ask the SB about me, naturally. When you make your own inquiries, please do not let it be known that I intend to work here. That might make it impossible for me to get away. Leave it to me, said McCoy, as they shook hands. Discretion is the word. Just leave your name and address with my secretary, and I'll look forward to seeing you when the campaign starts. Now, by a curious coincidence, there was an eagle-eyed named Ralph L. Gardner pulling freight and extra passengers out of San Luis at the time. For all I know, he may be there yet, but an even more curious coincidence, Lyle R. Gardner somehow got his initials reversed when McCoy's secretary took his name. As far as the Union Sugar Company was concerned, he was R. L. Gardner. And it was about R. L. Gardner that McCoy discreetly inquired. The replies had to be highly satisfactory. This Gardner was a hogger with whiskers enough to haul manifest freight and extra passenger, and his record was as clean as a Dutch girl's apron. When the fire was lit under the boilers of Bettereva's sugar factory, Lyle R. Gardner was there, and when the rented switch engine coupled into the first string of loaded beet racks, the seat of his overalls was planted firmly in the coveted cushion on the right side of the cab. He had the job all right, but he was a long way from being a hogger, and nobody knew it half as well as he did. He had never run a locomotive more than 20 feet in his life, and he must have been so nervous as to wonder he couldn't spot cars on a scale. Maxwell Swan was just a trifle shy on the yard experience at the time and blamed himself for the trouble. But I'll bet all the Chili's in Tampico that Jack Carroll knew the score in one move. Swan says, Carroll had to show me. At first he took it easy, but he overran the scale as I had done in the beginning. Carroll began to cut them on a closer margin of time. He was chopping them merrily when whang went a drawbar. So Carroll handed the job right back to Swan, knowing that neither he nor anyone else could spot cars with that kind of engine handling. In a big mainline yard with the pressure high and a yardmaster riding his tail, Carroll would probably have demanded an immediate showdown. Where the boxcars are thick to the work of one crew is tied to the work of every other crew in the yard. Delays are dynamite. But at Bettereva, you had more time than anything else. A delay might beat you out of a little spot, but that was all. Carroll, realizing that Swan didn't know the score, let it ride, and Gardner learned to run a locomotive. He finished the campaign, and before the service letters were made out, he corrected what little matter of the reversed initials. He also arranged for a return engagement next season. With an inevitable wardrobe and a comfortable supply of folding money, he landed in San Francisco after a free ride from San Luis and hit the SB for a job running a switch engine. He was willing to go anywhere on the system, and his service letter was as authentic as a government bond, even though it did show no more than 5 months' experience. The traveling grunt or somebody put him through an examination and found he knew more answers than the guy who wrote the book. That pleasing personality hadn't wilted either. Previously, the SB had hired hoggers for the night go at Dunsmuir, but none of them stayed long. Dunsmuir is up on the Shasta Division along the towering peaks of the Siskiyous. In the winter time, it gets colder than a well-digger's feet, and the snow is belly-deep to a giraffe. Most boom hoggers who hit California in those days were hunting sunshine and oranges and wanted no part of blizzards and snowballs. Gardner lit in Dunsmuir around November 1st. He was fairly proficient as a yog carter and was handling the same kind of cantaloupe he had pushed along at Bettereva. He was eager to learn, and he got by easily. Assured of a job at the sugar factory for the next campaign, he worked out a 10-day notice late in April and figured on a month or so among the bright lights of San Francisco before showing up among the beats. But he wasted little time in dalliance on Powell Street. The Santa Fe was hiring an occasional hogger at Richmond across the bay, so Richmond he went. He now had 3 service letters, one showing a couple of years as a fireman and 2 others showing a total of something like 10 months as a hogger. Hard, sturdy, plus whatever coaching he could pick up, he had given him a thorough knowledge of that old Bible in which are set forth the standard rules for the operation of trains. He hadn't forgotten a word of the locomotive catechism either. He had made a good impression on the Santa Fe super. I'd like to hire you, that worthy said, but things are pretty slow right now. Come back next fall and we'll see what we can do. Hire me now, Gardner suggested. Let's see if I can pass your examinations. I can go back to the sugar factory for another 5 months, and by that time you may need me. He passed all tests with flying colors, made a trip to establish his seniority date on the engineers board, and took a leave of absence until the following October. By the time the sugar campaign had ended, he could do all right on the extra board of the Santa Fe. He did so well, in fact, that he stayed right there until he passed away about 10 years ago. His son is running a locomotive on the same division now. When I gave Gardner a come-ahead token and latched onto my first string of beat racks, he was an entirely different guy from the earnest amateur Maxwell Swan worked with. He had learned the old Hoggard trick of placing rock landmarks right under the cab window and 1 car length apart. Since the beat racks were all the same length, he could have spotted the whole string without any signal, just shoving ahead 1 car length when he heard the weighmaster's gong. Gardner and I were pals on the job and off. He had a mandolin, and he borrowed, for my use, a guitar that belonged to the manager of this company store. It was a Spanish make, said to be more than 100 years old, and had a tone like an angel's harp. I fell in love with that instrument, but it was not for sale at any price. About the only way I could acquire title was to marry into the family. Anyhow, I played it for 5 months. Our concerts were usually staged at Gardner's house. He had married a San Luis girl since his other season at Betterava, and they had a cute little bungalow in Married Men's Row. Sometimes we put a sing-a-song in the lobby of the company hotel and augmented by a fiddler and another guitar player, and we played several dances of Orcutt, a neighboring village that was right in the middle of a new oil field. Yes, Betterava was a mighty pleasant spot, but the story of my sojourn there would not be complete without an account of the advent and hasty departure of Arnica Jack. Arnica Jack was an ancient and dissolute switchman, a contemporary of such legendary figures as Circus Doyle, Hee-Haw Mike, Red Shirt McCarty, and Stu McGaw. None of those worthies ever bothered the Eastern Railways to any degree whatever. All of them worked at times in Chicago, and all of them had spent at least 1 season on the Iron Range of Minnesota. They worked for Jim Hill when the wheat was moving out of the Dakotas and made the cane rush in Louisiana. They were essentially Western boomers. Arnica Jack went them one better. He never got off the Pacific coast. He had some kind of an in with the General Superintendent Buckley of the OWRNN, and with Fred Salters, who held the same office with the Southern Pacific at San Francisco. Both of those fine gentlemen had a soft spot in their hearts for even the most worthless and irresponsible boomers. Arnica Jack, a good card hand when he wanted to be, was congenital about it, as worthless and irresponsible as any man who ever hit a footboard. No one will ever know how many times his friends squared their records to fix that old reprobate up with a good job. The fact that he invariably blew up within a short time didn't seem to make any difference. He had worked under so many flags that I don't believe anyone knew his real name. The moniker of Arnica Jack was conferred on him because legend had it that while sojourning in the old SP Hospital on Valencia Street in San Francisco, he developed a raging thirst, drank a bottle of that soothing liniment, and wrecked the joint. He showed up at Betterava a little too late to get the job I landed. He had known about it and had started from San Francisco in time, but was delayed somewhere along the line. I had finally been working up for 2 weeks when he finally showed up. Not wishing to see the ancient boomer leave town without a road stake, Dick Hines lined him up a job on the old odd labor gang, on the positive assurance that as far as Arnica Jack, was concerned, there wouldn't be much labor to it, and the position was accepted. The principal assignment of the odd labor gang was the collection and disposal of rubbish and general policing up around the plant. Arnica Jack's first appearance was as custodian and motive power of a capacious wheelbarrow, plus broom and shovel. His beat was in what might be termed the civic center of the Betterava, that is, a dusty area in the front of the big company-owned general store, and said area bounded on the south by the railroad tracks and sugar factory. Inside a week, Arnica knew everybody in town. He declined to regard himself as a laborer in charge of a wheelbarrow. "I am," he orated, "the chief engineer and propulsion expert at Betterava's only Hinkerbinder." This usually produced a puzzled look in the face of his auditors. Then the old boy would elaborate. "The Hinkelbinder is the most wonderful machine ever invented by man," he would declaim. "What other vehicle has 2 go-ahead levers and no reverse? It operates without brakes and can be turned on its own length. It requires neither fuel nor water, nor needs neither headlights nor red lights." Or, according to Arnica Jack, it was the Hinkelbinder that taught the Irish to walk on their hind legs. In his book, nothing more important had ever happened to the human race. "Can you imagine a cop or a policeman galloping around on all fours?" he would demand. And who but the Irish is it that runs our cities? If it wasn't for the Irish, New York would be a vacant lot, Chicago an Indian trading post, and the Statue of Liberty would be stuck up for a cigar lighter in somebody's saloon. It wasn't long before Arnica was the best-known citizen in the village, and his wisecracks were passed around Betterava like those of the acid Wilson Meisner on the Broadway of that day. Then presently he was promoted. Instead of pushing the lowly Hinklebinder, he was placed in complete charge of a pair of fat and placid mules with a rubbish wagon attached. This outfit promptly became a Missouri compound with a simple engineer, and the guy who invented mules and the other hung-on hero who first harnessed a pair of them began to rank pretty close to the anonymous inventor of the Hinklebinder. The rubbish dump was down in the bottom of an adjacent canyon, and Arnica Jack would give any listener a thrilling account of the way he had to nurse to his air, even with the retainers up on the downgrade. To get out again, he claimed he had to kick the Johnson bar right down into the forward corner and cut in the booster. There were times when the outfit almost stalled, and he thought he might have to double the hill, which would have involved a claim for extra mileage. But the judicious application of a barrel stave always invoked the necessary added effort from the Missouri compound, and he never actually died on the hill. Arnica Jack was about as homely of a specimen as you can imagine. He must have been a notch or two past 60. His scanty crop of hair was a nondescript color between off-white and sandy, and old John Barleycorn had painted his schnozzle a rich crimson plentifully veined with purple. Yet the ladies, married or singled, always had a smile and a pleasant word for him. Young and old, he flattered them outrageously. He never failed to notice a new hat or a fresh summer frock. To hear Arnica tell it, they were invariably becoming. The line paid off, too. When he'd made his weekly collection of accumulated rubbish from the rear of the cottages in Married Men's Row, there wasn't a housewife that didn't have a tempting sandwich or a bottle of cold beer waiting for him. Betterava had a comfortable clubhouse where the unmarried officials lived on the fat of the lamb. Their beef, pork, lamb, and veal were no better than we got at the company hotel. It was all raised and slaughtered right on the company's old rancho. But they drank the most mellow of whiskeys, and their beer was the best that Milwaukee and St. Louis produced. The officers' ale was shipped all the way from the storied Portsmouth, where New England brewers worked to prove that Old England had nothing on them. Arnica Jack set himself in solidly with the steward of that club, so solidly that he probably did more drinking there than any two of the official family who also ate and slept on the premise. I'll never know how he worked the angle, but he got away with a whole case of that marvelous brew on several occasions. Running true to form as an old boomer, he lugged his loot over to the switch shanty and declared us all in for a split. Even Lyle Gardner, abstemious as railroaders generally come, was willing to forget his scruples and down a bottle or two. It was sometime in August of 1911 that an organizer for the Loyal Order of Moose showed up in Betterava. Lodge number 719 was being organized in Santa Maria. The charter was still open, and the initiation fee was attractively low. Something like 25 employees of the Union Sugar Company signed applications, and among them was Arnica Jack. He didn't give any reason to the organizer, but to the rest of us he confided, "I'm a cinch to be on the bum next winter, so I might as well have a begging license. If this outfit is taking in anything like number of members that the organizer claims, I can mooch for at least 2 weeks in any town in California." How well I remembered, he continued, when the Fraternal Order of Eagles was spreading like a prairie fire into the West Coast. You could walk into any barroom in the Golden State with a reasonable assurance that the white jagged gents behind the plank was a brother, and there was never a drinking man that was stingy with somebody else's liquor. Brother, he reminisced. I kept myself in a comfortable glow for damn near 2 years on that Eagles card. The Moose Lodge put on a special daylight initiation for the sugar factory employees who were on the night shift, but about a dozen of us, including Arnica Jack, were obligated at a regular meeting. We hired about all the rigs of the company barn to get to Santa Maria and back. The induction ceremony was beautiful and impressive, but after the lodge had been closed in due form, we new members adjourned to the nearby saloon to see if the flowing bowl was still flowing. Consequently, it was long after midnight when the last of the rigs checked in at the Betterava barn. I had made an immediate dive for the hay. Barnanica and 5 or 6 of the newly antlered ones who had bought sundry bottles along from Santa Maria were in the mood for wassail. They held forth in the lounge of the joint, and since the bedrooms were on the upper floor, their prolonged hilarity might have been overlooked but for one final touch. The manager of the hotel was an elderly gentleman of considerable ability and tremendous dignity. His name was Gray, but he was usually referred to as Lord Gray. The rest of the staff, from chef de cuisine to the humblest flunky, were Japanese. At 5 o'clock each morning a Jap boy would make a tour of the hallways to the upper floor. Hammering enthusiastically on a metal triangle, he had aroused the guys on the day shift, who had just 1 hour to dress, eat breakfast, and get on the job. On the auspicious morning, the Jap had company. When he had made his tour of the halls, he was followed by a procession of inebriates armed with the handy conventionaries found under beds in those days. Arnica Jack demonstrated that by holding the receptacle in one hand and the lid in the other, the clashing could produce like that of cymbals. The clamor aroused everybody in the joint, including Lord Grey, who, with his good wife, occupied a separate wing. All the rest of the celebrants heard the angry manager coming and did a quick duck. Only the old boomer continued to follow the Jap. He still clashed his China cymbals when the outraged manager arrived, so Arnica Jack had to take the rap. Lord Grey reported him to Superintendent McCoy. We ran old Arnica down the branch to Guadalupe that afternoon. We shook hands with him and wished him luck. Then we climbed back into the little old 1040. Gardner eased the throttle open and she shuffled away. Looking back, we could see the old boomer, a lonely and somehow pathetic creature, all by himself on the windy platform with the whistle-stop station. We didn't have much to say to each other on the short run back to Betterava and its sugar beets. I guess we were all mulling over the same thought. None of us believed we would ever see the ancient sod again, and I don't think that any of us ever did. He was a relic of the Lincoln pen and handbrake era, a remnant of the rollicking, reckless crews that manned the railroads when railroading was about the toughest game in the country. For him and for his kind, the end of the line was just around the next curve.